All right, this lesson is specifically a mid-series recap. So we're not going to cover anything new. We're just going to review everything we've covered so far and make sure that everything stays fresh. So that means if you already have a really good grasp of everything we've covered so far, you can probably skip this video and move on to the next one where we talk about route model binding. All right, so let's take a look at our progress. So far from the web browser, it doesn't really seem like we've done much. But if you think about it, we've accomplished quite a bit. Why don't we start with our article eloquent model? Okay, so we start by setting the fillable property, which protects us against mass assignment, so that the bad people can't be sneaky and change form fields to try to get us to update records that we didn't anticipate. Instead, we're explicit about which fields may be mass assigned when you do things like article create and you pass in an array. This means, for example, if there's some kind of permission ID on the table and you don't want them accessing that, well, if that was included here, they might be able to do that. But because it's not, even if they do try to include a permission ID within the array that you just passed to article create, because it's not in this list, we ignore it. So that's a very good thing. Okay, next we used the dates field so that we could add additional columns that should be treated as carbon instances. In our case, we added a published at for when the article should be published, and when we fetch that, we do want to interact with it as if it's a carbon instance, so that we can do things like article published at, and then format it. So maybe format it as year and the month. Well, because it's a carbon instance, published at will be an object, rather than just a string. And of course, don't forget, by default, created at and updated at will be the same. Okay, next, we talked about query scopes. And think of these as a way for us to assign a name to some kind of where clause. In our case, if we frequently find ourselves wanting to fetch articles where the published at is now or in the past, basically excluding anything that's published for the future, well, it's true you could repeat this every single time, but why would you want to do that? Instead, add a scope following this convention of the word scope, followed by the name you want to use, and then have it accept the query where you perform the clause once. Now, we can do things like article published, and that will trigger this method. And by the way, if you ever want to pass through some kind of value that should be used, then just do it like that, and that'll be received as the second argument. Okay, so that's query scopes. Let's continue on. Next, we learned about mutators and accessors following this convention. If, when we set some kind of property, we want Laravel to do something behind the scenes, then we can use this convention of the word set, then the name of the property, and then finally the word attribute. So you'll see this pretty frequently if I switch over to my user model with things like this. We could add set password attribute, and that will accept the password, and then maybe you could say this attributes password will be equal to a hashed version, so encrypt password. And basically, it allows us to do things like this. User password equals foobar, but actually, when we save it or persist it, foobar will be hashed. So we call this property, Laravel realizes that there's a mutator set, calls the method, it passes through foobar, and then we update the attributes list, or the array, and make that equal to an encrypted version of foobar. Really helpful. And once again, it keeps us from having to do this stuff over and over. Just declare it once. Okay, next, we learned about relationships. If an article is written by a user, then it stands to reason that when you have an article object, you want to fetch the user that is associated with that article. We can do that like so. Now, when we say article user, that will give us a user object that created the given article. And again, basically that will check to see what the user ID field is for that article, and then find the user that has that ID from the database. And of course, the inverse is true. And by the way, we can remove that from the previous lesson. If an article belongs to a user, then a user writes an article. So if a user can write many articles, then we use a has-many relationship. A user doesn't belong to an article, so we don't do this. And a user doesn't have exactly one article, so we don't do that. A user has many articles. Okay, so if we switch back, that takes care of our eloquent models. We've learned quite a bit in that area. Next, why don't we move over to our controllers? If we look at articles controller, the first thing we see is we've attached some middleware. And that's another thing you learned about in the very last lesson. Middleware is like an onion, so it gives us a way to create any number of classes that will receive a request and either pass it along the chain if there's no problem, or it can even reject the request and send the user somewhere else. In this case, if we want to protect a page from any authenticated users, like pages that only a guest to your website should see, then you could add a middleware. Please check to see if we have an authenticated user, and if we do, redirect them to the home page. They're already logged in, so just send them to the dashboard. Okay, let's switch back. And next, we learned that a controller is mostly responsible for receiving some kind of request, delegating as needed to get the request done, and then returning a response. So as you'll find, most of these controller methods are 1, 2, maybe 3 lines of code. And in fact, in the very next lesson, I'm going to show you how you can even reduce that further. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. So if we scroll up, here's where we can reference our relationships. If we want to say, get the authenticated user and save a new article, well, traditionally, to create an article, you would need to reference the user ID. But if we use eloquent relationships, that can be done automatically for us. Just go through the user you're interested in. So user, get all of their articles and save a new one. And by doing it like this, the user ID will automatically be applied. Next, we learned about form requests so that we can validate a form automatically. In this case, we are type hinting article request, which means before that method gets triggered, we are going to validate the request or the form data against this set of data. Now, if it fails, then we redirect back and we show them a list of the errors so that they can fix their problem in the form and try again. And if it passes, well, only on that condition do we trigger the contents of this method, with the understanding that we do have valid data. However, we also talked about how if you don't want to bother creating a form request, and really you just want to make sure that some field is present, 1 or 2, then you could call a validate method directly on the controller. So validate the request against some set of data. That's really useful for small, basic stuff that doesn't really warrant us creating a dedicated class. Okay, but I'm going to bring that back to what we had before. Next, if we switch over to routes.php, we learned that Laravel, out of the box, includes some authentication capabilities. And there's even stuff we haven't talked about yet, things like password resets. All of that is included as well. We'll get to that later, though. The important thing is, an auth controller and passwords controller come by default. So if you want to, you could recreate that on your own, but there's really no need to. Now, we can get up and running with a user system in a matter of maybe a few minutes. Okay, what else? Well, of course, you learned about things like using Blade and how to escape data or not escape data. Blade is an excellent templating engine. I very much like it. Next, you learned about environments and configuration. We create a .env file for every environment, and this specifies what kind of settings and values we want to use. For example, if we go to config/app, well, notice that we have debug set to, in our local environment, true. That makes sense, right? When we are working locally, if something goes wrong, we want to see the full stack trace to debug it. But of course, for production, you don't want that to happen. That's very dangerous. Instead, you just want to display a little whoops page. Sorry, something went wrong. Please try again later. We never want to show private server data to the user. So once you would deploy this, you would create another .env file on your production end. So that's the important thing to understand. This exact file will never exist on your production server. And in fact, if you use Git, which I hope you do, if you don't, it's okay, just start learning about it at some point in the near future. Anyways, you'll see that this file is included in your gitignore file. So we don't store this in version control. And that way, we don't pollute it with all of these passwords that we don't want to be included in there. So again, on your production server, create this file and reproduce these parameters, but then update the values. So for production, app debug should be set to false. That's how that works. And then within your various configuration files, we will grab those values where we need. Or you can even set defaults. So app debug, but default to false or true, whatever you want. Next, why don't we review a couple more things? You learned about database migrations. So if we check out our various migrations, here's one for creating an articles table. This gives us an incredibly simple way to define the schema for our database tables. And even better, these are stored in version control, which means you could send this project to a different person on the other side of the world, and all they'd have to do is run PHP artisan migrate to build up the exact database configuration that you have. So in this case, we want a primary key that auto-increments for the ID. We need a user ID, but also that user key is a foreign key. So we want to say, well, that references the ID field on the users table. And if we do happen to delete the user, then let's cascade down and delete the user's articles as well. Just make sure that this is the sort of logic you want. It very well might be possible that you don't want to do that and you just want to soft delete them and disable the articles. But that's a little higher level than we currently are at the moment. And then we have migrations for if we need to modify something after we've already deployed. Well, create a migration, in this case to add an excerpt field to the articles table, and then always remember to specify what to do in reverse. So if I ever need to roll back this migration, what would be involved with that? In this case, we would just drop the column. And then finally, well, let's take a look at articles create. We learned about how to clean up our views a bit, so we don't have to repeat ourselves over and over for common things like forms or headers. So you learned that we could have a master page, app.play.php. Here we go, and every view we have will inherit from this or extend this. And that way we don't have to copy and paste code like this for every single view. Not a good idea. But next we learned about things like, well, if we need the same form for a create and update action, we don't want to reproduce that form, or we don't want to copy and paste it. Because if we did, well, every time you have to make some kind of change, you would have to update the form in multiple locations. We don't want to do that. So instead, we extract it to what we call a partial, something like this. And then within each view, you can include that partial. And if you need to, you can pass through any parameters to override some defaults. So notice that we did the exact same thing for the list of errors. I will probably want to display a list of errors in multiple parts of my application for multiple forms. So I don't want to reproduce that. I instead extract it to a partial, and then I include it wherever I need to. Okay, so good job. Think of that as our midterm review to make sure we're all caught up. Now, in the very next lesson, let's continue on with some new stuff where we talk about route model binding.